Hey there. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whenever you happenstance into this truth bomb riff. My name is Patrick Lovell. I refer to myself as the producer, hashtag the producer, with the hashtag $71 trillion truth. And I am recording this on Thursday, May 22nd, 2025, at about 1:30 my time. And my mind is swimming with all of the elements that make up what it is that I'm trying to get your attention to understand. These truth bomb riffs, and I've said it before, they're part lecture, sermon, self help therapy because I'm sitting on top of monumental information that has got to penetrate somehow. It's got to get there in a way that just electrifies the nation because of what I'm holding. But it's really hard to penetrate this unbelievable dense ecosphere of information, misinformation, and all of those things that people find themselves following or paying attention to. And it's making the case, I'm making the case of this information that you've got to wrap your head around. And so what I typically try to do is to, you know, what I call touchstone into events that are happening on a daily basis that for those of us in the know paying attention, are really overwhelming. And I try to backtrack into what it is that I'm trying to get your attention to understand that really solves the riddle of everything. And yes, it's a giant puzzle. These discussions aren't really designed for folks that don't have an understanding of what our system is, that might be short on an education. A lot of people like to refer to these types of people as low information voters. They're not the kind of people that are going to be able to absorb this information. Now, at the same time, I'm not giving you unbelievable detail that I might have to if I were doing a PhD dissertation on a specific subject, and how I would have to get through the realms of academia to be able to achieve that, crowning achievement. Sorry to repeat the notion, but I keep finding myself, and what's really intriguing about why I'm recording this today is because for the past many weeks, I have been pretty consistent with a panel discussion with a team of people that I am so fortunate to know that you may say I've assembled, but at the same time, I just happen to be a conduit to because of my work called The Con, that you can find at www, and I know that's not necessary, thecon.tv, which is the blueprint for everything that I'm laying out. But it's incorporated to new initiatives that are exciting that I'm going to bring into this dialogue as I move forward, if I can remember, because there's so much I want to touch upon. But because of this work that I've been in the midst of for literally 13 years, that has taken over my life, that's led me to crisscross this country, I don't know, at least 9 times. It's cost millions of dollars. It's put me in a scenario to understand the best people in the country in context to what I already knew before I really got involved with this project. So, I studied political science, I minored in journalism. I've always had an eye on activism. There's a big difference between activism and being a professional, for example, and I don't get paid to do this. I got paid to do this. That's what led me to all of this information. But because it got so difficult to get this information out there in what we had initially thought was kind of the mechanism to be able to get this information to millions of people, things got weird. Things got weird that we're all in the midst of now that I've been trying to inform everybody about, in a way that's meaningful. So I guess at the outset, and I always forget to do this, but I have to say thank you for all of the new subscribers. Please like, subscribe, and share, and also share the hashtags below. But I think I have more of a, I don't know, a calm sort of approach to that because I just have to think through the information that I have to convey to you and just let the chips fall where they may. Because I know there are millions of you out there looking for this information. Now, one thing I want to say off the top that I think is going to grab a lot of your attention, and I hope that this will parlay into you being compelled to wanting to either get involved with some of the things that I'm laying down or at least be very active in the space that I'm pressing forward because I know millions of you are going to be supportive of this. So I'll say this first and foremost. So, over the course of the last many weeks, months, I've been involved on a weekly basis, as I mentioned, with folks that I refer to as the new untouchables. Now, these folks are people that I had reached out to initially because I was producing my work that I had already prefaced before, led to this investigation that led to the revelation of the largest criminal conspiracy and cover up in the history of the world that never ended. But all of the folks that I were able to come into contact with because of this incredible odyssey that I've been on are the best in the business. They're the top former regulators, prosecutors, legal experts, policy experts, experts of the law, the Supreme Court, and that's just for starters. And they have made themselves available to dialogue and be in a very active position to create a response concurrent to the calamity that we're in the midst of. And what do I mean by that? Well, for those of you, of course, paying attention, we're overwhelmed by all things Donald Trump's presidency that was predicated on Project 2025, which is a version of Christo nationalism that has overrun through the technocrats the ability to create a situation to where we could have what they call an executive presidency that functions like a CEO that's above the fray of democracy. And they argue that it's constitutional on a myriad of grounds, which is all ridiculous for anybody who understands just the basics of separation of powers, particularly the role of Congress as it relates to all things these executive orders that I have since learned over the course of the last several weeks. I've really gone deep dive into some of the folks that exist on this YouTube platform, like Judge Ludwig, who has laid out, for example, how all of these executive orders, all of them, are unconstitutional. And quite frankly, leads you to the understanding that if we had a functioning Congress, that an impeachment would be necessary because many of these executive orders rise to the level of high crimes and misdemeanors, which of course is the causality of why Congress would impeach a president, which we all know is a criminal president that is not participating, engineering. He's not engineering because he's not the technocrat. He's just this idiot that goes down to Mar-a-Lago who's a transactional asshole, fool, who's an idiot that blows my freaking mind that millions upon millions of people voted for this clown that are now going to destroy them. And as you know, what are we talking about now? Like 115 days, roughly, has done more damage to the democracy of the United States, its formulation of a separation of powers, and everything that was the result of the American founders fighting a revolution against tyranny has completely destroyed, and has been doing so in a way that he's been unchallenged, except, of course, in certain pockets of media that people respond, whether it's Rachel Maddow on MSNBC now once a week, and I can't watch MSNBC at all except for Lawrence O'Donnell. And I do watch Rachel Maddow, and I've made that case before, but she's tackling one significant piece of it and reacting to a lot of things that are out there and then trying to do, I guess, whatever she can in an hour format, given the resources that she has. And she's been in the mix for a very long time. But it's not what I'm telling you. And it's not what these people who are the new untouchables are capable of doing. And what has to be done, considering the realities of what's happening to us at the moment. So, in a nutshell, the reason that we have a lawless president is because the Republicans are complicit in destroying our democracy. They're establishing a Christian fascist right-wing agenda that props up what I just prefaced through Project 2025, and they have control of the Department of Justice, which is the entity, it's the institution that would be responsible for doing what it is that I'm doing, what I'm doing alongside our friends, the new Untouchables, who are obviously a lot more proficient and professional, and were at the top of the game forever. So they were, former high level people in charge of white collar investigations at the Department of Justice, having been involved with the likes of the Enron disaster, the savings and loan disaster, all manner, shape, or form of all sorts of high level white collar fraud, in addition to AGs, state AGs, and brilliant legal experts that come from the hive networks of the top legal institutions in the United States, including Princeton and Yale, and so on and so forth. And through these dialogues, in anticipation and in response to what's happening because of the reality that the Department of Justice is completely corrupt, the FBI is completely corrupt and under the leadership, which is a propaganda slash fascist sort of initiative, in addition to really control of all the red states and all of Congress, and not to mention the Supreme Court. And so as a result, what we are in the midst of doing is building a network of these incredibly adept, professional, skilled, experienced prosecutors and attorneys on all levels that are going to offer their services pro bono in a myriad of ways that enable us, the American people, to find those that are being railroaded or bulldozed from everything from the Gestapo like tactics, maybe that's a stretch, let's just call it fascist tactics, of ICE and the FBI, and of course, Department of Homeland Security, breaking down the front door of people's houses that are US citizens to deport them, among other things. And of course, the cases that we obviously had front and center, from Kilmar, Gabriel, Garcia, and everything that happened with, um, it's kind of funny. I was about to say evicting because that's on my mind as well. But deporting those that shouldn't have been deported, but not deported under the circumstances as well because of habeas corpus and due process, which is fundamental to the Constitution and the rule of law that the Trump administration and the billionaire apparatus is running roughshod over in a way that is a runaway train wreck that we can all see. So much so that it has brought millions of people to the streets to protest, and many of whom holding up signs that I am answering, proclaiming questions on signs all around the country. I've seen it. I've bared witness to it, where all of the signs are trying to wrap their head around corruption and fascism and how it's possible that we're in this situation. For many who are interpreting correctly so, feels like a science fiction novel of George Orwell, be it 1984 or Animal Farm, among others, which are of course accurate. We're living in a dystopian nightmare run by the orange turd in chief, who's about the biggest bloviating idiot in the history of the world, but who's transactional and who has an apparatus of billionaires and their technocrats that are very effective and very savvy at being able to carry out this coup, which is a war on the law, which means is a war on the United States, and what you could call a revolution against what is the United States. The same United States that was born 250 years ago out of a revolution against tyranny to create the Bill of Rights and the Constitution, to create, among others, birthright citizenship. Of course, legally in the construct, you can go further downstream in our country's evolution, to have the specifics, which I could address, but I don't know if I want to spend so much time litigating each and every aspect of what we're talking about because it does get slightly complicated All you need to know is he's just completely decimating with the complicity and the duplicity of diabolical villains being puppeteered by billionaires to run roughshod on anybody who can play defense and turn the tables. But I'm an activist in this role. Now I'm a professional because I was able to put all of these elements together, but I got quashed. My team got quashed. The truth got quashed to be able to make sure that this system could flourish, the system of corruption, which is the core tumor of this insanity that we're all in the midst of. And so I press forward as much as I possibly can, given my bandwidth and other things that I'm in the midst of, at least on a weekly basis, to try to get this message to you. And if you dig into my truth bombs, you'll discover incredible information. And among those, again, bringing it back to this notion of the new untouchables, is that I'm going to roll out through the alliance of the indivisible movement, as well as an appearance at No Kings, to present the new untouchables apparatus to achieve a platform that Bill Black, the foremost criminal expert as it relates to all things corruption, has created a platform called FIGHT. And the acronym is pretty amazing. I can't remember what it was at the moment, but all you have to know is it's FIGHT. And I'll probably explain down in the description what the actual acronym means. But it's going to be a composite response alongside another new untouchable that I work with, former State Attorney General Mark Dan, who has offered his law firm's legal services to be able to fight on two fronts. A, the assault on small business vis-a-vis the illegal and unconstitutional execution of the tariffs. So we'll be aggregating stories that are effective, that are in the midst of small business, trying to get an opportunity that wouldn't have the opportunity for probably any, but let alone this level of legal expertise fighting on their behalf pro bono, to push back against the unconstitutionality of the tariffs and all things off the back heels of Doge and all of these illegal executive orders that are, of course, unconstitutional. Now, in addition to that, these attorneys are going to step in and create vectors to where victims of the likes of ICE and Homeland Security and so on and so forth will be defended by this apparatus of some of the greatest legal minds in the country. And I think I mentioned, but I might want to reassert just in case you're kind of lost in all this language. Folks that are going to come out of the highest, law schools. They're alumni of these law schools, the most prestigious law schools in the country. I'm talking Ivy League law schools. Many of whom are coming out of these tall building law firms that have capitulated to Donald Trump. They're going to donate their time, again, pro bono, to be a part of this network affiliation, to represent people who can't represent themselves, who are victims of all of things unconstitutionality that are running roughshod. And we're going to take that and diffuse that in a way similar to those of you who might have been watching the series on Disney called Andor, against the empire, because you can't fight this in Congress right now. Congress, the Republicans have the numbers. You can filibuster, you can do whatever you set out to, you can have hearings and other elements, but they're not going to move the needle of what we've seen demonstrated by the numbers in both houses of Congress. There's certainly a lot of elements of that. And in addition to that, you can't fight on their home turf when Pam Bondi, the Attorney General of the United States, who was corrupt beyond comprehension, is just a personal law firm now, the largest legal institution in the United States, that is the institution of the people to protect America from this insanity, has been completely co-opted in a coup, where this Department of Justice is carrying out orders of this illegal presidency. Oh yeah, we're way past the 5 alarm fire, people. This is like David Byrne, who I used to quote earlier in my truth bombs, the great prophet David Byrne used to say, "This ain't no party, this ain't no disco, this ain't no fooling around." And I'm sure many of you know that. And this incredible response is going to provide both a pathway and a apparatus to be able to turn the tables on the so-called Steve Bannon led flood the zone with all of these things that were executive orders initially that have overrun Congress and, of course, created a constitutional crisis on many, 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 many fronts, not to mention that are backed up by the corruption within both parties of Congress because of a lot of stuff we've been covering here on these truth bombs, but not to mention SCOTUS, which I'll go into to decipher. But I wanted to touch upon that initially because that's what I'm going to be rolling out, in the next few weeks as we lead into the No Kings protest on June 14th. And also, I'm putting all of these specific elements together in a platform that needs to be approved by the people I'm involved with before we roll this out in a monumental way. I have a relatively small audience at the moment, considering the information I have, but it is growing. And thank you guys again. And I just, I guess I'll remind you, please like, subscribe, and share, but understand this apparatus will morph in a way that doesn't exist otherwise. And for those of you who pay attention to, like, let's say, Rachel Maddow and maybe Lawrence O'Donnell, you might be aware of a very intriguing and I think sometimes inspiring, very effective, but yet also serving a specific role, former Hillary Clinton General Counsel Mark Elias. And Mark Elias is a very capable attorney, and he's fighting on a lot of fronts, and he's got a really great podcast to keep us in the know on a lot of MAGA related attacks on voting, freedoms within the constitutionality of it all, and his response to that, which are just lawsuit after lawsuit after lawsuit. But he's also in the crosshairs, and he was named, and we saw this play out a couple of weeks ago, where 60 Minutes had him and proclaimed him to be the only the only attorney that was identified by Donald Trump for retribution as having the courage to actually speak publicly. Now, again, Mark Elias is at the top of the game, and he also worked for Covington and Burling alongside former Attorney General Eric Holder under the Obama administration. And again, like I said, he was the general counsel of Hillary Clinton's presidential campaign back in 2016. And is he effective? Is he a good guy? All things considered, yeah. But he's going to tell you one piece of the story that's not going to reveal what it is that you have to wrap your head around that I know. And this is where it gets really convoluted because a lot of people, and I'm going to try to keep it as simple as I can to offer as much clarity as I can, but a lot of people know both parties are corrupt. Everybody knows that everybody is getting played. Everybody knows the system is rigged. Okay, so this goes back now decades, right? That's kind of the call. And what's happened in the midst of all of this chaos is this fracturing of the American population, where millions of people who don't know how our system operates, who were basically baited and switched with all sorts of insanity through the propaganda of social media and the engineering that happens in the algorithms, to be able to lie, deny, switch the blame, and implicate, and create this sort of macro reaction that people in their own lives are struggling. So therefore, they got to place their blame somewhere. And so they all built this mechanism to basically blame the Democratic Party. And a lot of people justifiably blame the Democratic Party. Now, the Democratic Party, as far as I'm sitting, is the better of two choices. But I have also said that that situation has got us into this conundrum where we have the lesser of two evils, and both parties are definitely guilty of corruption. One just basically is smarter and does have a sense of empathy and has certain programs, especially behind the likes of Bernie Sanders and AOC, that really do care about the working class and people on Medicare and Medicaid and all of those sorts of things that are, of course, under siege right now, in addition to everything else I'm talking about. So I'm going to close up the first point, and then I'm going to launch into that, and then I'll hopefully keep your attention long enough to make you understand that I'm giving you the magic words and the key to what I always call some variation. If you're a J.R.R. Tolkien fan, the Ark and Stone, or if you're an Indiana Jones fan, the Lost Ark, or the the oh god, the Ark. The Rosetta Stone is the first thing that popped into my mind, but obviously Jesus's goblet, which I can't think of the name of it, and it'll come back to me because my mind is swimming. It's just one of the most easily referred to, pop culture kind of references. But it's the ultimate truth of what nobody understands that makes everything else possible. And so the first line of defense are these incredibly patriotic and insanely skilled and genius folks that are going to come to the rescue of the United States pro bono as activists. And I do want to make that point one more time, even though I opened up the door to it previously. What's the difference between activism and the likes of billionaire apparatuses that pay for technocrats to be able to do everything that we've got to unwind? That is completely rug pulled and destroyed the fractured United States by creating this coup against what is the United States, the democracy predicated on the law. But as we all know, it's corrupt. And Trump is completely naked corruption at a level that we've never seen from a presidency, even way beyond Nixon. However, that was all made possible by what it is that I've been revealing to you. And so I guess at the top, I should once again reveal that my work, if you want to dig into the blueprint of how this whole thing works, we've made what we think is an opus available for free because the system had to quash us. So we couldn't get on the streamers like Netflix and HBO and so on and so forth to be able to work within the system of publicity and newspapers and all the rest who would write reviews to get this in the right places to where it would, actually reach the tens of millions of people who needed to wrap their heads around this information. Because then if they were informed and they understood how the system worked, there's no way in hell would be in the midst of what we're in the midst of. But that didn't happen because corruption is in complete control. So fortunately, we have the resources to be able to make this available to the American people for free, because really all the American people buy our lies, and you can find it at thecon.tv. But that also bleeds into the solution, which is the Clean New Deal. And you can find that at thecleannewdeal.org. And I'm going to try to marry those two situations together off of the introduction, of course, of what we are, because of this group of people this hive network that we've been able to build is going to come at least fight for the light and the right in a very, Andor-esque Star Wars Jedi-like, way for the force of good, which is what this country is predicated on, because tyranny is evil. Aristocracy is evil. There are some good kings, I guess, in the history compared to others. But in terms of a structural component of what society is, it just chokes things. I guess you could have a benevolent king, but it doesn't happen very often. And when it does, it's still not anywhere close to the construct of what the American founders created through the dynamism of democracy, which requires an informed populace to hold power to account, because absolute power corrupts absolutely. Open up your feed every single day and you see more and more examples of it in ways that get more shocking every single day. And so, for example, this week, among other things, I just happened to watch Adam Schiff give a, address the Senate, I think at midnight last night, in response to this reconciliation bill, where his introduction was into the destruction of the Clean Air and the Clean Water Act that's been around since the 70s. Because in the 70s, we didn't have the regulations to prevent pollution from choking the cities all over the United States, particularly in California, because geographically, They have high pressure systems because of the mountains that choke millions of people on pollution, to the point that he had remembered when he was younger, they would issue warnings that you can't go outside because the air quality was so bad that kills people. Yeah, we knew this stuff in the 70s because of the technology and what would happen from the emissions from automobiles and other energy that we had created. That at that time, the Republican administration under Nixon had pressed forward these bodies of legislation that would use really the full scope of the resources of the United States' ability to channel research and development to find ways to improve air and water quality for the survivability of the American population. That's now all been decapitated because of this reconciliation bill, or that's what's on the line. And of course, anybody who's been following Trump going back to 2016, it's always been drill, baby, drill. Make America Great is led by Donald Trump's notion of white supremacy, Christo-fascism as a sort of, shall we say, religious theocracy that enables the king. That's all this sort of fusion of all of these things from Project 2025 and this billionaire hive apparatus and these libertarian sort of scenarios that wanted to basically, through taxation and all of the maneuverings that are taking place, and this has been on the table really since most of my life, but particularly the 80s, where they wanted to squeeze the federal government into the size of something you could fit into the bathroom, is Grover Norquist, one of the key architects of this sort of tax code, had formulated 30 years ago. And what does that mean? Well, it means that when you deregulate the federal government's ability to work on behalf of the American people, to protect the American people, in the vacuum of that, it can be manipulated, and it has been, based on everything I'm revealing to you, by the naked corruption that has evolved from this, behind the scenes shadow corruption that has taken over our government for decades. But it's gotten worse and worse and worse. But because of what took place with what created the impetus for what my work reveals, from the great financial crisis of 2008 forward, that was the last time that we actually had a government that could protect the American people. In fact, that was the impetus for what led me to be able to create this project and produce this project when I went to my partner, a guy by the name of Adam Bronfman, who came from great means and was also a very thoughtful guy, is a thoughtful guy. And he said, if you can figure out how we went of, by, and for the people to of, by, and for the corruption or corporation, I'm in. Because the way I had presented my case post 2008 was I'm not expendable, and neither are the American people. What the hell is going on? That's where my journey started. And when Adam said, if you can figure out how we got basically overrun by the corrupt corporation, in the back of my mind, I was like, well, is the corporation corrupt? Because that's what led me on a series of work, my first documentary film called Forward 13, Waking Up the American Dream, that took place during the Occupy Wall Street movement, that led me to understand what I had already understood, but what the nation was trying to suss out in the aftermath of the 2008 great financial crisis, was how corporations actually had created complete control of our democracy. And quite frankly, I've been on this journey ever since to deconstruct how that happened, which led to the con. And the con is how corruption works at the highest levels. And seeing is believing. You've got to understand how this whole thing works within the construct of deregulation, desupervision, and decriminalization that effectively just creates what we all know now because of Trump: lawlessness for the powerful, tyranny, kings. No kings rally. America is in the process of trying to find its footing, literally, after being hit so hard by this fist of betrayal. But yet, that's part and parcel to what's been set up for decades, because most of our countrymen aren't even aware of what our country is. They're not even aware of the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, and the mechanics of Congress and what Congress's role is in holding other branches of government in check. Same with our courts, and quite frankly, same with the executive branch. Okay, but we got overrun by big money decades ago. And it's again tied to what it is that I'm going to reveal at the end of this. But you've got to go on this road because right now, as I said, last night in Congress, Adam Schiff is fighting, to the wee hours of the morning to try to save, not to be confused with the SAVE Act, but to save the Clean Water and Clean Air Act, which is losing. And I probably, as of today, we've lost, which is 40 years of being able to provide America the opportunity to move forward in technology that created the green, clean tech and, the electric car revolution, of which, everybody's favorite oligarch, the richest man in the world, Elon Musk, was at the outset of, and ultimately because of all of these sort of initiatives to turn us into that global powerhouse with renewable energy, ironically became the ultimate welfare queen to use his ill-gotten gains to betray the United States, to develop Doge and all the rest of it. Okay, even though he's now kind of in the backseat because he's pretty much got what he wanted. Because what Elon Musk wanted, really above all else, besides getting his fingers inside the payment systems of the Treasury and having information on everybody, because it could basically go to what he and Peter Thiel and the other cats, that have been involved with the PayPal mafia to begin with. And when you throw in crypto and blockchain and everything else, if you understand that whole panoply, you'll understand that really that's kind of an evolution to central bank digital currency, ironically, the Trojan horse. And yeah, he's already on that path in a magnificent way for him, in addition to everything that he wants with Starlink and, maybe development of going to Mars and whatever, all of those other facets of Elon's, apparatuses, not to mention the more we learned about his father and apartheid South Africa and how that, fomented in like this Nazi, ideology as, mankind spreads into the universe, quite frankly. It's kind of a science fiction thing in its own right. And so, yeah, that's all part of it. But, the construct of the attack on the Constitution and nobody being able to fight back, obviously it falls on the shoulders of the American people to protest by the millions to say enough is enough. Because do we have a shred of free and fair elections in the future? Maybe in the blue states. I don't think we do in the red states. And I don't know on a federal level, watching Mark Elias and all of these other attacks from, the technocracy behind Project 2025, not to mention all of the Jim Crow-like manipulations of elections that we saw in all of the swing states, that is next level rigged game. And for those of you who know me, because I'm a producer and I'm in the film business and I, use a lot of metaphors from the film business. If you're lost in translation about the manipulation of voting, for example, I always thought that Martin Scorsese's Gangs of New York did a fantastic job where, what's his name, the Butcher, and all of the others were basically corralling everybody off the boat who were immigrants and said, I'll give you a job if you vote for this, among other manipulations. So in the South, they're all predicated on Jim Crow laws to make sure that they could suppress the minority vote. And they're very good at it. And there's all sorts of techniques in there that, for example, most recently, Greg Palast, the incredible journalist who I think works for The Guardian now, but he came out of this, really incredible forensic audit background, both in journalism and I think in intelligence as well, laid out how, for example, in the 2024 election that gave us Donald Trump, that like 3.5 million votes were squashed because of some of these techniques, which means that it was just completely manipulated. So the notion of free and fair elections without it being manipulated, completely out the door, because these technocrats on the Republicans who aren't activists, they're professionals. They got paid by the billionaire class billions of dollars to go make this happen. And unfortunately, uninformed voters, low IQ, low information voters, don't have a freaking clue of what's going on. And so many people didn't show up. And many people didn't show up because they were also anti-Biden because of what was happening in Israel, right? Because of Gaza and the pounding of Gaza, which many people, after October 7th have designated genocide. And it took a while for me to fully comprehend that because of who I am and where I come from. I'm Jewish. I come from a mixed family, but I am Jewish. And I do believe in Israel as a state that has to exist because of all of the thousands of years of anti-Semitism and all of the horrors that manifested throughout Russia and Europe and Eastern and Western Europe for a millennium to the point of the Holocaust. And so I have always been an ardent supporter of Israel. But like all of the other Israelis that came to the streets by the tens of thousands before October 7th to try to take down in a somewhat of an impeachment thing, the Israeli democracy is different if you can call it a democracy, which you really can't. But, they were desperately trying to take Netanyahu down on corruption. And then October 7th happened. Now, for those of you who have paid attention to what I've been saying this whole time, is that corruption births and fuels fascism. Fascism is my mortal enemy. Why? Because I believe in democracy and liberty and justice for all and the rule of law and the integrity of law and the dynamism of the markets and the dynamism of intelligence. You go as far as you can to achieve your American dream, and you have to have the scaffolding of the Bill of Rights and the Constitution of separation of powers for great things to happen, which is why we were a superpower. That's what gave us the power to win the revolution against the greatest military power and financial power on earth at the time, King George III. And then the apparatus, of course, and I could go on and on and on about, the parliament and of course the Navy and the Redcoats and the East India Trading Company, which is basically the corporation. Okay. And that might have been the corporation, which was the original new aristocracy that my colleague Eric Vaughn wrote about in a beautiful essay to try to formulate what it is that we were going to try to tackle when we first got on the road 13 years ago, where we surfed the Occupy Wall Street to try to find out what the hell was going on. And we did. And so now we're here in 2025, and I'm telling you, corruption bursts and fuels fascism. And I'm laying out this very difficult argument that I've got to be able to address because last night there was a murder in front of the Washington, D.C. Israeli embassy where a couple by the name of, and I made notes here if I can find their names because obviously the information just came out right before I pushed play on this, but it was Yaron Lashinsky and Sarah Milgram, two 26-year-olds, beautiful, vibrant, very smart and capable people, both working at the Israeli embassy, were murdered last night. And as it turns out, they were just about to get married. They were on their way to Jerusalem. Horrific story, a tragic story, breaks my heart story, okay? And it could be escalating too. And like, of course, the first things that come out of the story is the concern for anti-Semitism, okay? And that's always a huge concern. But we live in this very perverted scenario that are manifesting from all of the things I had, kind of teased when I talked about Orwell, for example, 1984, and Animal Farm, which is prolific for what we call doublespeak. Up is down, left is right. Everything is upside down, inverse, perverse of what it is that you think, because it's mind control. It's psychology to control the masses for the few. It's a perversion of how this whole thing works, which is really the story of history. That's why we had Pharaoh to the aristocracies and the monarchies and the oligarchies and the Holy Roman Empire and everything. It's mankind because we have to work together in society to be able to achieve what it is that we can't do on our own. And if we were to be on our own and be completely independent, that's a whole nother story. And some people do that and they fancy themselves libertarians, but they're not the ones that are living out in the West with nobody on the land, that they own their land, that they, created their own house with their own hands and energy and clothing and food and everything else. I mean, if you can do all of that stuff, great, but most of us can't, right? And so, what's that have to do with these two American citizens who are going to go get married in Israel being murdered last night? And how does that fit into corruption, burns and fuels fascism, given what I just kind of prefaced with Israeli citizens coming to the streets to protest the corruption of Netanyahu before October 7th? Well, my theory is that October 7th was known in advance, that it is very, in my mind, plausible that the Netanyahu administration gave Hamas just enough rope to hang themselves with. That there were discussions and determinations behind the scenes with the regional powers that be and the construct behind all of the real power from intelligence and money and all of the rest of it that constitute how this world works, that worked in unison to maybe give the green light in some passing fashion, because those who were in the know may have thought that Netanyahu, and if Netanyahu gets found out for this, I'm sure it'll be the end of him. But I don't know if we'll ever find out because of what's been happening in the United States since 9/11. All I can tell you is that when I watched, for example, on that horrific day where the guys on the paragliders that were, the likes of Hamas, that we knew had tunnels and they were, basically building missiles and hand in the hand. I mean, a really, really difficult sort of scenario, given all the things that have been happening in Gaza with the other uprisings that have happened really since the beginning. But Hamas has been in control since the 90s. And their declaration was they were in basically the fight to the end with Israel, that there would never be any peace, that there would never be any two-state solution. And so they got what they wished for. And as a result, because in the Middle East, Saudi Arabia is a religious theocracy, but that is puppeteered or managed or in collusion with obviously the Saudi royal family. So it's a religious theocracy within the context of a monarchy. Do you see a correlation between Donald Trump's unitary presidency and being above the law, all of these things, to where the Trump monarchy is untouchable and the trade-off is the religious theocracy? That religious theocracy that's been playing out for decades, primarily through very, very sophisticated billionaires that created billionaire hive networks and funded through nonprofits and all sorts of manipulation, the likes of Leonard Leo, who backdoored $1.6 billion, or at least that's the budget that we know of. I don't know if it, how much of it was direct into the hands of the likes of the Supreme Court justices, Clarence Thomas and Justice Alito, and how much influence that had on Justice Roberts. And then, of course, all of the other elements of the conservative court, which all incidentally got locked up in a 4-4, tie today to prevent the first, which was an absolute expression of what I'm talking about, in terms of this Catholic charter school in Oklahoma that would be funded by public taxes, which is it abridges. I don't think that's the right term. It's an affront to separation of church and state. We fund public schools. We don't fund charter schools, religious charter schools. That's religious schools fund themselves. They don't need to be funded by, obviously, the public purse, our taxes, our collective taxes, people who might not be Catholic. But in this paradigm of what I'm revealing to you, that's the trade-off. And the nature of the big money and Leonard Leo and some of these finance guys that have worked behind the scenes and literal backdoor into the Supreme Court to do things like basically etch-a-sketch history and put themselves in a position to where they betrayed the Constitution. Not to mention, of course, the 14th Amendment, Section 3, which lays out that if you're involved with an insurrection, you can't run for a public office. And of course, the state of Colorado took that to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court got away with saying, yeah, you're not going to determine the outlook of the election. That's what they did. They just rug pulled Colorado's constitutional right to be able to bring a suit that's like, there's no way we're going to put Donald Trump on the ballot because we know he's guilty of insurrection, which, of course, our Supreme Court, because of the lack of impetus by Merrick Garland and the Department of Justice during Biden's administration, didn't get the investigations rolling fast enough, which was part and parcel to, of all people, Eric Holder pronouncing in 6 months before the election it was up to the American people to save us because he knew that the courts were betraying us. But that was fresh because he was the one who actually let Wall Street get away with destroying tens of millions of people and walking with tens of trillions of dollars illegally, which is where I come in. But I'll come back to that because where was I initially when I was with, this tragic murder of this young couple that was going to get married in Jerusalem? And by the way, the husband, whose last name I mentioned earlier, Lachinsky, turns out he's Christian. For those of you who immediately assume he's Jewish because he was working for the Israeli consulate. No, he's Christian. And by the way, that's interesting in so much that those that are behind this so-called anti-Semitism sort of approach, particularly in universities and everything that we've seen out, that have attacked these tall building law firms because of what's happened as a result of protests of Gaza and the genocide, and what I would now also include as extermination. Two terms for me as a Jewish person whose entire worldview is anti-fascists on the grounds of the Holocaust have to look through the lens of reality, given the corruption of Netanyahu and the reaction of Israel when dudes on paragliders were able to create all sorts of carnage as a result of this ongoing war between Hamas and Israel, of course, but over one of the most highly sophisticated walls that exist in the world in paragliders into, of course, this non-defended music festival, and then all of the different areas of Israel in the proximity of the wall. When we saw demonstrated over and over and over with this Iron Dome scenario that Israel can knock out 2,000 missiles in a 12-hour expanse, but their eyes were on West Bank supposedly, and they had information about January 7th in advance of that, or January 10th, I should say. Of course, like 9/11, the people that respond to that say it was a failure of imagination. They just didn't connect the dots. They weren't ready. They got caught flat-footed. And oh yeah, here we go with carnage now for the last since October 7th, right? So we're over a year, and the thousands, the tens of thousands, possibly more than that, that have murdered, many of whom are civilians. And I have seen come to the streets recently that are now saying and proclaiming, get rid of Hamas. We've got to get rid of Hamas. They're the ones that are responsible. And that's an intriguing aspect of this horror that's led to the likes of famine. And I've seen the pictures of the 12-year-old girl that is emaciated, and she's a victim of this in ways that are beyond comprehension. Especially, again, I got to drive home from the perspective of somebody who understands Auschwitz and who understands Treblinka and who understands all of the manifestations of the Nazis and why did the Nazis do what they did. Recently I came across this incredible speech in Berlin by obviously fascist expert Timothy Snyder, who is now relocated out of the United States. He was at Princeton. He's now up in Toronto. And he laid out this big picture analysis of why Hitler, in details, what Hitler's anti-Semitism was. For those who understand Hitler, you understand that he was a megalomaniac. He lived homeless, and he was in the streets, and he blamed not being able to get through the art sort of study and everything else upon Jews that wouldn't let him move forward. And so he had a real angst against Jews from the very beginning, but so too did pretty much the entirety of Austria and Germany at that time, as did most of Europe, because of what I'm saying, led to the pogroms and anti-Semitism for over 1,000 years. And by the way, Yanis Varoufakis says a lot of the same things that I am, that it's 1,000 years of Jewish reality that's led to what we're in the midst of. And so it's a real fucking nightmare, conundrum, a nightmare of epic, let's call it biblical proportions, quite frankly, because like I said, this guy Lesvensky, who got murdered last night at the Israeli embassy, is Christian, and the continuity there that enables everything that Netanyahu is in the mix of is quite frankly the fundamentalists. I'm trying to think of the Christian fundamentalists that have been kind of part and parcel to this right wing Israeli move for a very long time that also incorporates the billionaire structure. So, for example, Israeli billionaire, Jewish billionaire Sheldon Adelson's foundation created all sorts of incredible resources for the settlers in the West Bank and everything that came out of the agreements of giving Gaza back to the Palestinians, or at least different partitions of it, and all of those complicated things that have taken place over decades. Their funding was like, we're going to go take your land with the settlers, and they created over the course of now decades this sort of zealot religious Orthodox class that has been, quite frankly, allies of these Christian fundamentalists now going back to the 70s. And a lot of them believe in what's known as Armageddon or the rapture. They're doing this because they believe this is the end of the world, I think. Many of them. At least that's what seems to undermine a lot of their philosophy. Not to mention, of course, who do we have as Secretary of Defense? Pete Hegseth. What does he have on his chest and a tattoo? Some ode to basically the Crusades. And so he's one of them. And we know that, right? You know that. And so that's all undergirding this stuff because, again, when Netanyahu responded, how do I want to phrase this from where I'm saying? Netanyahu, I've seen this happen over the course of my whole life. And so I have a really good understanding of the conflict and what's been going on the entirety of my life. I mean, we're talking about going back to the 80s, but in Lebanon and so many things. But then I learned so much more about the Six-Day War, the 1967 war, all of the things that created Israel, the backstory, really everything that goes into it. But like I said before, Saudi Arabia's power derives from their massive oil fields, right? And it has been since the end of World War II. There's been this relationship with the Saudi royal family and Western powers, particularly the English, the British, and the Americans, through our giant oil companies that had then become part and parcel to really the global economy and global currency, particularly as it relates to the dollar's role as the world's reserve currency. All of that's at stake, okay? And it has been for now decades. And it's only playing out this way, again, because when you don't stop this stuff in its genesis at the beginning because of corruption and lawlessness, and then you allow billionaires to be able to manipulate this entire situation, this is what you get. Ukraine war, similar situations, not exactly the same, of course, but I have to try to finish this presentation to bring you full circle to understand what we're in the midst of and why it's so beyond tragic and it's so incredibly difficult to sort through some of these things, particularly when you have the ideology that I do, that Israel has to exist because of everything that came forward and how incredibly devastating it is to see what we're in the midst of, right? So this couple gets killed. They're about to go get married. That's going to be another element of Trump anti-Semitism propaganda, even though it's real, okay? But at the same time, what's happening as a result of Gaza and extermination and literally destroying any remnant of the Palestinian people in Gaza. And I'm sorry, if you don't think that's what's happening, you obviously haven't been watching. And boy, I've been watching the whole time, watching schools, watching hospitals, watching, starvation and all of the other things. And it's now at a mop-up mission. And yet there are still remnants of Hamas that are hanging in there in the tunnels, and the people themselves want them gone, right? Because they know that it's the end, that either they're going to be somehow, like we've seen, deported, I guess, in mass, but nobody in the Middle East really is accepting them, and they haven't, and that's been another part of this, problem. But when you put that on top of the reality of the money. For example, but the insanity that the Qataris are funding whatever the remnants are of who's holed up in the and actually housing in Qatar that are now giving Trump the 747, and they also have paid billions of dollars to Jared Kushner and um, I believe Steve Mnuchin as it relates to 666 Park Avenue. There's all of these backdoor channels and scenarios that include now, because of what's going on with crypto and the Trump meme coin and Melania meme coin, I've seen numbers that Trump has pocketed north of $10 billion between that crypto activity directly that gets deposited in Swiss bank accounts, in addition to the value of Truth Social, which are just all of these bad actors that get their money from, quite frankly, the fossil fuel paradigm that's baked into our financial system that are now backdooring, in some cases, directly, i.e., the 747, which I learned from William K. Black last week, was just the first ante in the insane carnage of corruption that overgirds this situation that creates this calamity that's led to, and again, I don't believe I can't believe I'm saying this, but genocide and extermination by Jews to another culture. Never in a million years. I always thought fight the good fight. Fight the good fight for law and order, for democracy, for dynamism, for the intelligence that gives Israel its real value in the Middle East, which they perverted. Their value is their military, their tactics, their technology, not to mention their intelligence. Okay. And I'm talking about intelligence like Mossad, for example, right? That's their oil. And it's incredibly sophisticated. And who needs this? The autocracies, the religious theocracies, the oil mullahs, the guys that are in complete control of the oil, the Saudis, for example. Maybe you remember during Obama's administration, we had the Arab Spring. That was suppressed. That was suppressed by this apparatus. And I think Netanyahu and the powers that be in Israel on that side of the fence that were being paid by the Adelsons and, to marry these religious extremists in the West Bank and everything else, where there could be no negotiation because Hamas never wanted to negotiate. Am I saying that the people in the occupied, well, in Gaza or the West Bank, all of them were Hamas? No, I don't think they were. But this lends itself to the conundrum that I'm going to now blend into pop culture that was just demonstrated that through so many millions of people kind of in disarray who had been really religiously committed to Game of Thrones. When in the end, Daenerys Targaryen firebombed King's Landing, and the whole thing was, well, all of the innocents are going to die. And Daenerys Targaryen was like, well, they should have thought about that when they allowed Cersei to destroy me. I'm going to destroy them. It's war. And right after October 7th happened, Netanyahu said it's war. And I was like, okay, what does that mean? Well, what it means is everything that we have seen happen and play out since. Which means that the guys who have the resources, who have the power, who have the control, they can do whatever they want. And what's shocking about all of that stuff, if everything I'm telling you isn't shocking enough in context to the United States, is that what happens when the military, working for a corrupt autocracy, gets the orders to go annihilate the opposition? I'm afraid we might be in the looking glass of that as we speak in the United States, giving all of the illegal behavior and lawlessness that Trump has been able to get away with through the entirety of his administration thus far, when it's as clear as day to anyone, even people who don't have a legal education or who haven't been in the trenches of corruption for decades. You can see clearly that everything that they are doing is to bulldoze, and I hate to use that metaphor for anybody who knows a lot of the conflict in Israel and the Palestinians and so forth, the bulldozing of the law. They're not going to be stopped. The manipulation is incredible. And so the only way to potentially create a remedy requisite this corruption is to fully understand and embrace the truth and put your faith and your, quite frankly, money to a degree, but that's not why I'm doing this. This isn't a pitch, but money are resources to build, for example, these genius legal people, professionals that are going to provide pro bono work for victims of everything that's going on between Doge and this lawless presidency in a diffuse way to bring these lawsuits through state attorney generals in blue states, and in addition, in a very intriguing way, working with law schools around the country to bring these cases, hopefully, with people that might run for the midterms on an integrity platform that is going to turn the tables on the corruption. I'm going to be able to provide you all of those details, okay? Well, let's check off the boxes. If the environment is important to you, we're on the verge of losing the landmark legislation of the Clean Air and Water Act. They're going to unleash commercial interests in public lands. They're going to destroy the environment for the quick fix to move money to this oligarchic billionaire apparatus, first and foremost. Made possible by the corruption, of course, of the Supreme Court and Congress. And of course, media not demonstrating to you what I have been the entire time that has led to this monstrosity. And I'll just finish up with a couple of different things to drive the point home. I mean, in this reconciliation bill, they're getting rid of Medicaid, Medicare, SNAP programs to finance $3 trillion in tax cuts for the uber rich that have already been floated trillions of dollars illegally based on what it is that I'm telling you. This is just the end of the line. And this is what Mark Elias and former Attorney General Eric Holder and former Attorney General Merrick Garland and the entire apparatus of the Democratic Party is not going to tell you, because they enabled this to happen. They made a choice in 2008. Okay? And what happened in 2008? Millions of people were sold liar's loans. They didn't know what was going on. They got greedy, a whole number of other things that could have, gone in the matrix. But the paradigm was they were sold liar's loans. Doesn't matter if they were assholes and they bit off more than they can chew and they didn't know what was going on, and there were people who smoked cigarettes who, saw the Surgeon General's warning and they still smoked until they died of cancer and got lung cancer and all of that. Some of that stuff gets a little complicated. I'm a little bit more black and white. I used to believe in buyer beware, caveat emptor, honestly. And because I thought that was our, sort of responsibility as a citizen, how you navigate this world is part of the game that we're all amidst of, that you can get to your American dream if only the law works. Because if the law works, then liar's loans aren't a possibility. Because liar's loans became liar's securities, which became liar's credit default swaps and derivatives that took a $4.5 trillion housing bubble and created a $900 trillion, $800 trillion global calamity, where the entire globalism predicated on everything from 1971 forward, because of what we call fiat currency, that is predicated on the globalization infrastructure paradigm through NAFTA and neoliberalism over 50 years that followed the World War II. But ultimately, that was financed by the middleman, and in this globalism structure that had a lot of upsides, but it had now enormous downsides that we can see clearly, that have enabled this just smash and grab scenario of modern day imperialism that are locked and loaded in this whole thing. How and why? Because the millions of people that got caught up in the 2008 great financial crisis, including pensioners that were sold a bill of goods that they didn't even know because of corrupt money managers that were selling them liar's loans throughout this entire process, their retirements got destroyed. And because of that, the white working class got destroyed, which was the last remnants of the working class, of what maybe followed World War II to create the largest middle class in the history of the world. It just became kind of the middle class in China that was now investing in, what we called AAA housing that nobody ever thought could blow up because nobody would ever stop paying on their houses. But nobody understood what was going on with everything that I'm telling you, which led to, of course, what we show you in the con. But there's more, because all of these liars' loans that were put into this global calamity that blew up the world was then used by our court system to create illegal foreclosures. And they used the same illegal documentation and perjury in court because nobody knew what was going on, particularly media, to destroy millions of Americans, many of whom the carnage and the collateral damage ended up in the streets, suicides, divorces, this incredible, atomic bomb that was what I call financial terrorism. And it was arguably more disastrous to the United States than 9/11 and really the global wars on terror. They're not really apples to apples, but we spent a whole hell of a lot more on the 2008 great financial crisis, and many, many, many more people were directly impacted. Now, obviously, there was more people that died in the wars across the theaters in Iraq and Syria and Afghanistan, and then later, in Lebanon and so on and so forth, that cost tens of trillions of dollars, and the corruption there was absolutely insane. And that was, of course, to prop up the military industrial complex that's tied to the oil financial complex, which is everything I'm telling you rules this whole scenario. But they were all propped up after the 2008 great financial crisis, because the other corollary that you got to understand is that in the run up to the 2024 election, the sum total of Jack Smith's investigation down in Mar-a-Lago, trying to think of Letitia James, sorry, the state AG in New York, and her civil fraud cases against Donald Trump, and of course, in the Southern District of New York, where Donald Trump was convicted of 34 felony convictions, and also down in Georgia in Fonnie Willis's RICO case. The sum total of what Donald Trump was in the midst of what the government told us, is that Donald Trump defrauded the United States using deceptive acts and practices, which is deception, to basically in a racketeering scheme using falsification of business records as well as fraudulent electors on the Electoral College, that basically, he had 91 criminal indictments that the American people should have seen through, that this guy is a criminal on top of the insurrection. But these incredibly skilled and diabolical villains that are paid technocrats in these verticals of this billionaire apparatus, through all of the different games that have come from all of this deregulation, but particularly as it relates to, of course, things like Citizens United, that completely corrupted the system. And by the way, bought media at the same time. And so all of these truths that I'm revealing to you could not make it to the American populace. And when you don't take down corruption, corruption is going to take you down. That is the story of every empire of the last 1,000 years. Okay? We're right in the midst of it. And these guys initially were playing roulette with this. And again, I've got to emphasize this because there's so many Americans, particularly on the side of the Democratic Party, that are relying on the courts, particularly the appellate courts and the diffuse nature outside of the federal courts, to be able to fight back legally to try to flood the zone with, all of this monstrosity of this illegal behavior, of this unconstitutionality, of this Trump nightmare, this Frankenstein, this Trumpenstein, I like to call it, Godzilla of corruption, that is completely got everybody on their heels, and we've got to turn the tables. But the nth degree of this whole thing, and I'll close this up now, okay, is what I'm telling you, that we, in the aftermath of the great financial crisis, instead of taking down all of the bad actors, the criminal CEOs that laundered and created these, everything that I just told you that the United States government was indicting Donald Trump for, they did to the tune of tens of millions. And then they whitewashed it in our courts, which created MAGA. It absolutely crushed the American credibility and integrity. It made it such that the law is dead for the power. You can't hold power to account. So again, like Bastiat told us in the 17th century, in the midst of French imperialism and everything else, that when a group of men discover plunder, they create a legal code to authorize it and a moral code to glorify it. That's tyranny. That's what we created the global, the shot hurled around the world in the revolution to be able to create the Bill of Rights, the Constitution. And the only way that scaffolding can work for a country of, by, and for the people is if you have integrity of the system, which through all of these elements that I've laid out is going to lead to this integrity platform to try to get people to fight back and deal with this. But I am the only guy that's standing here telling you that we get provided tens of trillions of dollars illegally to this criminal apparatus that doubled down and bought everything and created this carnage. And why I'm saying this on this particular day, in light of the tragedy that happened at the Israeli embassy, in light of the tragedy of the genocide and extermination by a Jewish enterprise that just blows my mind, all things, even though I know that, look, yeah, I understood the plight of Daenerys Targaryen. I also understood that in World War II, we had to bomb the living fucking hell out of Dresden. We had to, the Soviets had to absolutely destroy the Nazi party in, Ukraine, quite frankly, and Stalingrad and all the rest. They had, because that's what happens in war. It's life or death. And yeah, it was all of those things that happened from the Great Depression through World War II, where we ended up having to live to the better angels of our nature, just like we did in the Civil War. And then we created all these lessons learned because of what happened because of the Great Depression, by way of things that I'm just now going to close with, that create the clean New Deal that led us to become this superpower, to where we had an opportunity to become, in order to form a more perfect union based on liberty and justice for all, because you have to have integrity. You have to have character. That composite is in a war right now with the complicity, duplicity, and hypocrisy of the denizens and the demons of the dark that work for this autocracy slash fascism that all emanates from corruption. Because when you can control the full faith and credit of the United States for criminals, and you take the cops off the beat, what do you think is going to happen? Everything that we're in the midst of. And so during the final stages of the campaign, when I saw that Tim Walz was a good guy, and I knew that Harris had been put into her position because she was able to play both sides because of what happened in 2008, because she was on the side of Eric Holder as the Attorney General of California and everything that played out along those lines. But was she a decent person in comparison to Donald Trump? Oh, yeah. Was she flawed? You bet your ass she is. She's like any high-priced, defense attorney that can, spin a yarn any way they need to. But what they chose to do in the 2024 election cycle was basically etch a sketch everything I'm telling you. They wanted to not be the prosecutor versus the felon. They wanted you to feel good. They wanted to get inside with, all of the celebrities from Oprah to Beyonce to this and that. And I remember we saw some really great stuff because I like them, Eminem. And then, of course, the rest, they all got paid, by the way, to go out and campaign for Harris. We talk about Elon Musk spending $277 million on the Trump presidency. The Democrats had $1.5 billion. Wow. But what Elon also had was this consortium of villains behind the scenes that helped him turn X into this massive propaganda platform. And unfortunately, Blue Sky wasn't able to turn the tables in a meaningful way as fast, not to mention all of these things that were going on with the Jim Crow laws and voter suppression. These guys are tactical geniuses, okay? They know the whole story. They funded it. They spent billions of dollars because they were getting trillions, okay? Look at that for return on investment. And now they want to control the whole thing. And yeah, how close are we to something where the American people, I don't know if it'll ever get as bad as what I see the carnage. And I don't want to say that as like, it's befuddling. The insanity in Gaza is insane, okay? But what happens if we are all protesting which I've been involved with the 50501 and the hands off rallies, and I'll be involved with the No Kings rally to present the previous stuff that I opened up with. But what happens if the guns come out and the guys that are in the military decide to shoot all the protesters? That's called, let's call it Putinism. That's what Putin has erected in the Soviet Union, fallen, collapsed Soviet Union into the Russian Empire because of who he is. That's what Russia is right now. And yeah, there was Alexei Navalny, and there was people that push back, and they're dead. Anybody who gets in Putin's way, dead. That's the vision of Trump right now. Why does he connect with these autocracy leaders like Kim Il Jong in North Korea? This is insane. And the millions of Americans that should have risen up to not vote for this stuff didn't, because they were like, yeah, you know what? All of the stuff that's in Gaza, I can't vote for Biden. And I guess that was the difference amongst the suppression of the votes. But I'm not here to litigate that. I'm here to tell you we're in deep shit. And that the only way through this is to know the truth, which you can get at the con.tv and My Truth Bombs and the new Untouchables, which I've been rolling out, but ultimately in the Clean New Deal. Because as I was, screaming again, as I have been for 14 or 13 years, from the mountaintops to people that can't hear or see me for the most part, and yet you're growing, but we got to grow in mass, is this notion that, and I was trying to get the Harris administration to follow suit on this, but at the same time, I was trying to get the American people to fully understand this, because I was saying, and I was posting to the people like Rachel Maddow and everybody else who had done great work on, Ultra, to reveal that MAGA is basically America First, that took place with McCarthyism and all the stuff that they did in cahoots with the Nazis before World War II, of which Fred Koch comes out, not Koch, funny. Fred Trump came out of, who was influential in Donald Trump, as was all of these criminal elements. Get me my Roy Cohn, which filters into it. But Fred Koch was the guy who built Stalin's infrastructure that made them this powerhouse. They're all about central power. They're all about anti-democracy. They are fascists in one form or another, okay? It is your duty as the American people to turn the tables on this and rebel. We've done it better than anybody in history, from the American Revolution to, of course, everything that created the Civil War, to the progressive movements, and of course, all things the World War II. The GIs were the ultimate anti-fascists, and then, of course, what we ended up with in the civil rights movement. The only peaceful way to turn the tables on all of this is doing what we're doing with millions of people coming out to the streets. But if you don't have the truth that I'm telling you, it's over. And it's pretty close. I think we're on a needle's edge from it being completely over. Okay. And so the Clean New Deal, and I was trying desperately to get this information to Tim Walsh, who I know is a good guy, as a history teacher who was 25 years in the National Guard, and a football coach. He doesn't come from the apparatus of power. He doesn't come from, a white shoe law firm or a private equity firm or a hedge fund or an asset manager. He's not in the centrifuge of power. He was chosen, ironically and cynically, by Eric Holder, who created all of this madness, because it was this aw shucks guy from Minnesota that actually liked to hunt, that could potentially talk to crossovers that may go MAGA. And it didn't work out as well as it could have. And I kept saying to Tim Walsh what I call the 4 questions. What I'd say, Tim, did you ever teach your students in your career that the purpose of the United States was to create a fiefdom for billionaire oligarchs that got tens of trillions of dollars illegally to suppress and subvert the law? Is that what you taught your students? How would he have responded to that? He would have acted like I was crazy, even though he kind of knows it, but he doesn't know all of the elements that I know. So who am I to say something that, governor of Minnesota doesn't know the information I have? Well, he doesn't. That's what I've been doing for 13 years, because I am a professional in corruption. I've got the information nobody in the country has. So again, what does that lead to? The 4 questions. What is qualified immunity? Well, the police can shoot without having to worry about it, without being convicted of murder if they're corrupt. I've never said that police shouldn't be able to shoot to kill. I would have liked to have seen the police shoot to kill more than they did on January 6th, for example. That didn't happen because, of course, all of the betrayal that was happening in the Pentagon and whoever was involved, from Eric Prince to Steve Bannon to the Mercers and all of the guys that they had in the Defense Department, because there was more firepower in the Beltway that could have easily suppressed January 6th like that. But of course, President Trump had them all stand down. Now he's going to use the power of the presidency against us. That's qualified immunity. Nobody, not a company, not a police officer, nobody should be above the law. But that's what that is, as is judicial immunity. It's ridiculous, as is, if you can believe it, judicial immunity. There's some good reasons for judicial immunity, but not for what's happening in the Supreme Court. And then there's presidential immunity. Everything that's happening, presumably because of what the Supreme Court did 6 months ago to basically make everything that the president does above criminal prosecution during the presidency, is insane. And we should have been in the streets by the millions the day that that happened. We should have been in the streets, ever since we learned that the likes of Leonard Leo are providing billions of dollars behind the scenes to be able to buy the Supreme Court of the United States. It's insanity. No person or company should ever be above the law. And then ultimately, what is the Electoral College? It's a perversion of a minority that can use all of these tricks to be able to work for the more sophisticated, diabolical villains of being able to lie, steal, and cheat to get power. Like I prefaced earlier in this conversation, if you don't know what that means, go rent the movie or find a way to watch it. Gangs of New York. They did a really great job of showing you how Americans in the past have manipulated election and electioneering and scheming and all sorts of stuff. It's an American pastime that not many of us are aware of it. But that leads us into the precepts of the Clean New Deal. And I've been going on for a long time, but what I opened up with, first and foremost, was that the Clean Air and Water Acts are about to be sabotaged while we drill, baby drill, right into your head, right into your lungs, right into your life, to where millions of people are going to have absolute devastating consequences from this. And if you're thinking to yourself, we've already had a climate crisis for most of your adult life, and you're like, well, where are we now in this whole ordeal? Well, everything I've laid out to you is the reality, which means that the climate crisis is on the way back in. And people might be thinking to themselves, well, even if we were able to fight this and we were all on the same page and we had a normally functioning apparatus of Congress to be able to make appropriations and do what needed to be done, how are we going to pay for that? People don't understand that we provided $71 trillion illegally to a corrupt mammoth international racketeering enterprise that destroyed the world and the law. That's what we're all living in the composite of in this nightmare at the moment. And the way to turn the tables on that is, one, we've got to create a new Glass-Steagall. What does that mean? You can't have a financial institution speculate with other people's money. You have to have separation of commercial banking from financial banking. Do we need finance? Do we need banking? Oh, yeah, we do. Do we need the higher ups through what we call modern executive compensation to be able to loot and pillage from the banks that they're CEOs of so that they can destroy millions of people and they can walk away with the loot? No, that's a stupid question. And so what we have to do is we have to create a new Glass-Steagall Act, because that's what we did after the Great Depression, but with the caveat, and this is the most absurd caveat of all, but it's the full truth, nothing but. You can't use the full faith and credit of the United States to float illegal criminal behavior on a global scale. You can't do that. By the way, it's already in the statutes, but guess what? Nobody stopped it because you didn't even know it happened. And yeah, it happened. And that's what I'm a roadmap to. And nobody in power or media told you the story. I'm the only one. And it's the truth that controls everything else. The flip side of that, like Bernie Sanders says, and he's correct, we've got to end Citizens United. It's just legalized corruption, bribery. And now it's taken a turn for the worse because Qatar is bribing Trump with with a 747 that's 13 years old, by the way. The whole thing is absolute ludicrous. And the next precept of the Clean New Deal is we've got to show how $71 trillion was looted to millions of people to create the system that we're in the midst of. How are they getting away with it? They have unlimited funding. That is guaranteed by you. It comes from you. It's not your taxes, but it is the full faith and credit of the United States that they've been able to backdoor because of the way the functionality of Congress and the power of the purse is supposed to behave and what didn't happen in the aftermath of the great financial crisis that I've uncovered that came through Federal Reserve Act 13.3. Are there better ways to spend $71 trillion than on autocrats destroying the world? There is. And it's going to happen with millions of you who believe in democracy and are anti fascist. But you've got to get on board with the facts. You got to understand how this whole thing works. Because if you're flying blind, trust me, you can't see the forest for the trees. And all Trump is the emperor's new clothes on really bad acid that you can't look away from. But he's just a projection of everything else that's going on. The next four precepts of the Clean New Deal are exactly what I just laid out in the four questions. Nobody is above the law. No qualified immunity, no judicial immunity, no presidential immunity, and of course, get rid of the Electoral College. And the final two pieces of the equation are members of Congress cannot front run by having insider information about what the government is going to fund that can increase stock value. That's absolutely absurd. That's just straight up corruption. And then the final piece of the equation, I think, and we could all talk about this. Well, actually, there's two more pieces, but we have to get more good people that are law abiding that want to use, the integrity of the Constitution to be able to hold power to account to the Supreme Court. So if all of these bastards from Mitch McConnell all through the Koch Foundation and all of these billionaires for the last 3 or 4 decades could figure out a way to pack the court with 6 justices that are enabling the destruction of the United States that we all know are corrupt, as I've seen in the meme, corrupt as fuck, then of course the only way to really reconcile this situation is twofold. You got to have no judicial immunity, but we got to get 13 Supreme Court justices to match, I believe, the 12 appellate courts. I think there's a continuity there, but I've seen experts suggest that we need 13. And so that's part of the precepts of the Clean New Deal. No insider trading for Congress. And then finally, yeah, we really need to talk about term limits because the guys that know how to play this game better than anybody are the guys that have been there forever. I'll never forget several years ago watching Mitch McConnell stand deadpan with his mouth open on the floor of the House, the Senate, because he was obviously too old to serve, but he's there because they know his vote is going to be the vote that it's going to be. And he still holds unbelievable amount of power. This kind of stuff creates, unfortunately, the perversion. We've got to have new blood, new life in the system, but it might be too late. We might ourselves, as American citizens, be looking at a fate. Not you can't compare us because we're not Hamas. We're not religious fanatics. We're pro-democracy. We're anti-fascist. We're the type of people that have an education. We understand systems. We understand the economy. We understand the law. So what are you doing? Literally, what are you doing? I'm proud to say that I'm part of working with my longtime friend and colleague that we're laying out a new platform called Corruption Incorporated. I'm kind of a periphery and building a lot of eyeballs to that fact. But more importantly, for me, is the new untouchables and what we're going to do because of what we're going to lay out with the No Kings movement and be able to provide the greatest legal minds in the country in a pro bono initiative to help the American people that are being crushed by this betrayal and betrayal to our democracy. But in the end, it's the Clean New Deal that has to be erected. Because if you can't understand that we have provided tens of trillions of dollars for free illegally to this system, then there's no way in hell you can understand how to fix it. What I am is the black box of our destroyed democracy. That's what I am. I'm the pathway to the truth. And when you have the truth, you live in light. When you have the truth, you're bulletproof. When you live a lie, you're depraved. When you live a lie, inside you die. Stop lying. Stop buying lies. When you embrace the clean New Deal, when you, me, and everyone you see who isn't a Nazi, who believes in integrity, dignity, decency, all of the dynamism of freedom and liberty and justice for all, our future is the clean New Deal. And when we prop that up above the darkness, that is our destiny, to be the force of light to overcome the darkness. Thank you for listening. Please share, please like, please subscribe.